The stars above the royal world of Thalra burned cold and distant, as if even the heavens refused to witness what had become of the mighty king's only daughter. Once she had marched at the front of armies with banners trailing behind her, and soldiers chanting her name. Once her voice had echoed across command halls with the authority of 10 generals. But now she was nothing more than a shadow of what she had been. Her name was no longer spoken with honor, but buried in whispers. Avoided like a curse. The throne room where she had once stood proudly was now close to her. Her father the king did not even look at her when the council voted to exile her. They claimed it was mercy to send her away instead of executing her. Mercy wrapped in silence. And shame. Her body bore the marks of betrayal. A deep scar ran from her temple to her collar, sealed not with pride, but out of necessity. Her spinal implants, once a gift of the Empire's top scientists, now flickered and pulsed with erratic energy. Her voice trembled when she spoke. Her mind often drowned in flashes of the ambush that broke her unit. She had screamed for help in that burning sky, but none had come. And when she limped back home through sheer will, she was met not with warmth or healing, but judgment and disgrace. A warrior who failed. A daughter who did not die in battle, unfit, unworthy. And so she was placed in a small shuttle with minimal fuel and sent toward a remote outpost near the edge of charted space. No farewell. No guards, no ceremony. Just a sealed message informing her that her exile was final. She watched her homeworld shrink behind her until it was only a speck among thousands. Then it disappeared completely. Far from that empire of cold thrones and empty words, on a lonely planet with cracked soil and rusted skyports, a man named Jake worked with grease-stained hands and quiet patience. He had come to this forgotten place by choice, not exile. He liked the silence, the space, the broken machines that waited for someone to care enough to fix them. He had no medals on his walls and no flags by his door. His only companion was an old repair droid with one leg slower than the other, and a kettle that always whistled too soon. Jake preferred machines to people, but not because he disliked kindness. It was because machines didn't lie, they didn't pretend. They broke, and then they healed when you worked hard enough. He respected that. The day the sky cracked with fire and a small black ship fell from orbit, Jake was outside welding a busted shuttle ramp. He looked up and saw the trail of smoke. He did not run. He didn't panic. He simply shut off the torch, picked up his bag and started walking. When he found the crash site, the ground was hot and the air buzzed with static. The ship was scorched but intact enough to recognize that it wasn't human. Its design was all curves and sharp edges like a predator in sleep. The hatch was jammed. Jake worked with a crowbar until it hissed open. Inside, it was quiet except for the soft pulse of failing life support. He found her there curled on the way floor, blood dried on her armor, skin pale under layers of dirt and pain. Her eyes fluttered open as he leaned over. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She only stared at him like someone waiting to be struck. But Jake didn't hit. He didn't ask questions. He just carried her out of the wreck and back to his shelter. The days that followed were filled with silence. She lay in the spare cot, while Jake cleaned her wounds. Her body twitched at every touch, like she expected cruelty. Her hands stayed clenched even in sleep. Jake did not speak much. He let the warmth of food and the quiet rhythm of his work fill the space between them. He called her Ara not because he knew her real name, but because it felt right. Ara sounded strong, like something worth saving. At first, she didn't eat unless he left the room. She didn't speak unless she whispered in dreams, but slowly her walls began to crack. She sat at the edge of the table during meals. She watched him fix broken engines and repair cracked consoles. One night, when the wind outside howled through the old metal walls, she asked him a question in a voice rough with rust. Why do you help? Jake looked at her with grease still on his hands in a cup of tea in front of him, and simply said, "Because you were broken, and I know how to fix broken things." Her eyes widened a little. No one had ever said that to her without disgust or pity. No one had ever spoken to her like she was just something that needed time and patience, instead of a burden to be cast aside. Era didn't speak again that night, but the next morning she helped him carry tools. Her hands were still unsteady, but she tried. Jake began to teach her how to weld, how to clean a power coil, how to rebuild old solar panels. She learned fast. She made mistakes, but never the same one twice. Her silence turned into short words, then sentences, then questions. "Why do humans use such weak metals? Why don't you upgrade your droid? Why do you whistle even when you are sad?" Jake answered all of them. He never told her to stop asking. And one day, when a rusted shuttle engine roared back to life under their combined repairs, Era let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a battle cry. She was healing not just in body but in soul. The fire in her eyes that had once led armies was beginning to return, but far away beyond the stars in council halls and warships, rumors had begun to stir. A signal had been picked up. A ship from the Royal Fleet had crashed in the human territories. Some said it was just junk. Others whispered that the broken daughter had survived. The king remained silent, but his eyes turned toward the edges of the map where old soldiers disappear and old names rise again, and back on the quiet planet in a dusty workshop, filled with broken tools and quiet strength, the girl who had been thrown away picked up a fusion cutter with steady hands and smiled for the first time in years. She was not a princess anymore, not a general, not a failure. She was Era, and she was still alive. Days turned into weeks on that quiet edge world, and Era changed. With every sunrise, the bruises on her skin faded slowly, but the wounds inside her ran deeper than any knife could reach. She was not just healing physically, she was becoming someone new, someone different, someone more than what her father had once made her to be. Every morning she woke up before the sun to clean the workshop, organize the tools, and start the day. Beside Jake, she did not complain, she did not retreat, she simply worked. Her hands, which had once only known war, now shaped metal, repaired joints, tuned wires, and held tools instead of weapons. Notice the way she moved now, with purpose, not hesitation. She walked as if she was grounding herself, with every step holding herself together. When he watched her fit an energy cell into a busted panel and adjust it until the hum became stable, he saw not just skill but care. She was learning not because she had to, but because she wanted to. There was something peaceful about fixing what was broken, and Era held onto that feeling tightly, as if afraid the galaxy might steal it from her again. One afternoon, while they worked on repairing an old hover loader, Jake handed her a manual and told her to lead. She hesitated for just a breath, then nodded and took over. Her voice was steady as she read the steps aloud, her eyes scanning for trouble before it happened. When the machine lifted off the ground with a smooth purr, Era let out a quiet breath of satisfaction. Jake clapped his hands once and said that was perfect, and Era felt something shift inside her, like a door opening a little wider. She had been called many things in her life, but perfect was never one of them. That night, Era sat outside looking up at the stars. The sky on this planet was clear and deep, filled with constellations she had never learned. She used to know all the star charts from her sector, used to command fleets through asteroid belts and solar storms, but now she stared at unfamiliar skies in silence. Jake came out with 2 mugs and sat beside her, handing her one. They sat like that for a while, not speaking, just listening to the wind and the distant hum of cooling engines. Sarah asked him why he lived out here, why so far from others, from home, from everything. Jake smiled a little and said home is where things grow, and peace is where noise is quiet. Era turned that over in her mind again and again. Peace was not something she had known. Even as a child she had been trained to command, to obey, to conquer. Her father had raised her not to feel but to win. And yet here in this silent, dusty place surrounded by broken tools, And a human with soft eyes, she was learning what it meant to live one. Morning, Era found an old combat drone buried beneath scrap behind the shed. It was large with scorched armor, and one missing arm, but the central core still blinked faintly. Jake said it had been junk for years, not worth saving. But Era knelt beside it and began to work. She studied the circuitry, patched the power flow, recalibrated the targeting system, and rewired the processor. It took 3 days and every spare part they had. Jake watched her through it all, offering help when she asked, but mostly staying back when. The drone powered up and rose to its feet. It let out a low mechanical growl, then stood still waiting. Era gave it a command and it responded immediately. She moved it through a series of drills, testing its response and agility. It followed perfectly. Jake raised an eyebrow, impressed, and said, "Now that's something special." Era nodded and said, "Softly I used to command legions, now I command one, but this one listens better." Jake laughed and Era let herself smile. It was during one of those quiet nights that trouble returned to their doorstep. A freighter pilot landed on the outskirts of the repair station, limping in with a damaged thruster. He spoke fast with eyes full of fear and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He said pirates had started moving again, searching certain systems, interrogating traders, demanding information about someone specific, a royal someone, a survivor. A girl with a mark on her face and implants in her spine. Jake glanced at Era, and she met his eyes. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice was calm when she asked the pilot what the pirates were saying exactly. The man said a bounty had been placed on the girl, dead or alive, the payout large enough to buy a fleet. Jake told the man to keep flying and speak of nothing. He nodded and left quickly, as if even staying on the planet too long might cost him his life. Era sat in silence. After he was gone, her eyes narrowed, her thoughts loud. She did not speak for hours, but when she finally did, her voice was steady and clear. She said if they were hunting her, they would come here, and Jake deserved the truth. So she told him everything about her father, her title, the fall of her unit, the exile, the disgrace, the emptiness. She spoke with no tears, just truth. Jake did not look away. He did not step back. He simply nodded and said, "You are not what they call you. You are what you choose to become." Era felt her chest tighten at those words. She did not know why this human with his simple tools and quiet ways could see her clearer than the royal court ever had. From that night, Era began to train again. Not to become what she was, but to rise as something new. She set up drills in the yard, using metal scraps and drone parts. She combined alien techniques with human styles, adapting and sharpening her movements. Jake joined her, sometimes clumsy but willing. They sparred, they laughed, they learned. Era's strength returned, not just in body but in fire. She no longer ran from the past, she faced it with every punch and step. She spent nights studying old maps and radio signals, adjusting the workshop systems to scan for enemy movement. She started building new drones, combining human tech and alien design, making them smarter, faster, stronger. Jake called her brilliant and meant it. One morning, she stood on the roof of the station, watching the horizon with the wind in her hair and a blade in her hand, and she whispered to herself a promise. "They threw me away, but I will not disappear." She was no longer just healing, she was preparing, because she knew the storm was coming, and this time she would face it standing. The quiet peace that had once surrounded the outpost began to thin like morning mist as danger crept closer with every passing day. The winds carried whispers of movement beyond the nearby moons, and trade signals spoke of patrols disappearing in deep space. Jake kept his radio tuned low while he worked, but Era listened carefully to every broken signal, every burst of static, every encrypted message that slid through the old receivers. Her instincts had sharpened again, not from fear but from readiness. She was not the same girl who had crashed into the dust months ago. Each morning before the stars faded, she stood in the yard and ran, her drills with the rebuilt drone beside her. It moved with precision under her guidance, turning, spinning, blocking, and striking with speed that impressed even Jake. Era had added her own designs to its core, giving it better balance, smarter decision logic, and armor that bent instead of shattered. She called it Flint because it sparked when struck, but refused to break. Jake watched her from the roof where he worked on solar nodes and new antenna wiring. He admired the way she carried herself now, not as a warrior bound by command, but as someone choosing her own path. Her eyes scanned the horizon, not with suspicion, but with clarity. She had come to understand the land, the weather, the patterns of local traders, and she moved among them like one who belonged. And yet Jake could tell something inside her was still held back like a river behind stone waiting to break free. Then one evening the sky darkened before the sun could set. A strange shimmer appeared above the cliffs, and the scanner tower began to blink with a signal Jake had not seen in years. 3 ships slipped through the clouds fast and low with black hulls and quiet engines. Pirate ships, not the wild kind, but the organized kind, the ones that worked under the flag of bigger powers. Jake knew the signs too well, and Era knew it too. She turned to him before he could speak and said it clearly. They are not looking to trade. Jake moved fast, gathering weapon supplies, fuel, and data cores, while Era stood on the ridge watching the ships land near the North Canyon. She didn't flinch, she didn't run. Her mind worked quickly, mapping their likely paths and predicting their approach. She gave Jake instructions without raising her voice. Lock the back doors, reroute the power grid, rig the entrance gate with a fail-safe pulse. He followed her lead. Without hesitation, when the pirates came, their approach was silent, but Era had already positioned herself on higher ground with Flint beside her. The lead pirate walked like someone who thought himself safe, his armor polished, his weapon polished, his words oily. He called out in the alien tongue, asking for hospitality, claiming to need fuel and repair. Era replied with silence, and Flint stepped forward with a quiet growl. The pirate paused just a moment, and that was enough. The battle began not with a shout, but with a flash of movement. Era dropped down behind them, landing without sound and striking fast. Her blade moved with purpose, each swing calculated, each motion clean. Flint blocked the escape path while Jake triggered the gate pulse, knocking out their coms. The pirates scattered, trying to regroup, but Era was faster than they expected and smarter than they could handle. She moved between them like wind through fire, cutting, disabling, disarming. She did not kill unless she had to, but when she did, it was swift. Within minutes the canyon was silent again, except for the hum of Flint scanning the wreckage. Jake came down from the tower with a bruised shoulder but a grin on his face. He had never seen anything like it. Era stood at the center of the dust, her armor scratched, her breath steady and her eyes calm. She had not panicked. She had led Jake, helped her carry the bodies to the ridge where they buried them without ceremony. Pirates or not, the dead did not need to rot under the open sky. Era said a few words in her language, not blessings, but acknowledgments. Jake did not understand the words, but he understood the weight behind them. After the graves were covered, Era looked out toward the stars and said, "Now they will know I live." She returned to the outpost and entered the comms room where she sat before the transmitter and opened a secure line. She had rebuilt from old circuits and stolen codes. Her fingers danced across the keys as she typed a single message, short and sharp in her native language. "I am not dead. I remember. I rise." She sent it once and then shut the system down. Across the stars on distant worlds, the message traveled like a ghost, moving through hidden channels and quiet stations. Former soldiers once loyal to her command paused. As their devices lit up with a signal they never thought they would see again. Among ruins and refugee camps and broken fleets, those who remembered her name whispered it again with fire in their chests. She was alive, she was fighting, and she had sent a call not for help but for reckoning. One of them, an old pilot turned rebel, opened a signal of his own and sent it to the underground network that still burned beneath the broken empire. His words were simple but clear. "The fire lives in her. The legend returns." Era stood on the balcony of the outpost, that night looking at the stars with Jake beside her. He asked her what came next. She said they would come again, not just pirates, but others. Worse than them, those who wore emblems of power, those who once called her kin. She did not fear them. She welcomed them. Jake asked her if she was ready to be a symbol again, to lead the fight, to carry the weight of what her name once meant. Era looked at him with a small smile and said, "I will not carry their weight, I will carry my own." From the distance came the hum of old engines and the flicker of ships breaking through the atmosphere. Not enemies this time, but all eyes drawn by her message, pulled by her fire. They had come not to follow a fallen princess, but to stand with a woman who had survived, who had rebuilt herself with strength and with fire. Era turned from the sky and walked back inside the outpost, her steps firm, her heart steady, her voice clear as she said to Jake, "It has begun," and he knew without asking what she meant. The girl they had thrown away was no longer lost. She was rising, and soon the stars would know her name again. Outpost no longer felt like a place of exile. It had turned into something else, something sharper, something alive. The rooms once quiet were now filled with voices. The courtyard echoed with drills, and movement ships landed and took off carrying rebels, couriers, mechanics, old warriors who had once fought under Era's banner. They came from distant moons, broken stations, forgotten battlegrounds, following the signal that had spread like a secret fire through space. They did not come for revenge, they came because someone had dared to rise again. Era trained with them each morning under the open sky, her steps exact, her commands clear. She taught them not the old ways of war, but something different, something built from her time in exile, her time with Jake. Discipline without fear, strength without cruelty, unity without control. She made the weakest among them stand tall, and the strongest learn to protect instead of dominate. There was no crown above her head, no throne behind her words yet. They followed her with a loyalty deeper than blood. Jake moved among them, quietly repairing weapons, boosting signal strength, reinforcing the perimeter, teaching the newcomers how to blend human tech with alien systems. His presence grounded the camp, and Era knew it. She watched the way people respected him, not for rank, but for how he never raised. His voice never gave empty promises, never treated them like tools. She had learned from him more than combat and strategy. She had learned what leadership could feel like when built on choice, not fear. But peace was not built to last in the shadows of empire. Far across the stars, deep in the cold halls of the royal citadel, the king sat on his throne, surrounded by generals and advisors whose faces hid fear behind protocol. The message had reached him long ago, and though he had said nothing, his silence had been louder than war drums. He did not speak her name, he only issued one order, and it passed through secret channels, across systems, until it reached the ears of those who killed without question. They came not in fleets, but in silence, cloaked ships with advanced tech and hearts colder than space. Elite assassins loyal only to the king, trained not to fight wars, but to end stories. They landed on the edge of the valley just before dawn, their presence like a shadow settling across the land. Flint was the first to detect the breach, its sensors lighting up with unfamiliar signatures and immediate threat alerts. Era was already moving when Jake brought the report to her hand. She assembled the squad without hesitation, positioned scouts along the ridge, and checked each defense line with calm precision. Her eyes did not waver, her voice remained steady, even as others began to feel the edge of panic pressing into their chests. She had known this would happen, she had waited for it, not because she wanted the fight, but because running would have meant surrendering her story again. The first wave came fast, moving through the darkness without sound. Their blades curved, their armor sealed, their minds focused only on one task. But Ira met them in the field, her movements sharp and clean, Flint flanking her side as her fighters executed the plan she had prepared. The battle did not look like the chaos of war. It looked like a rhythm, like a song of defense and fire. Each motion had meaning, every strike was earned. Jake fought too, not on the front, but within the command center, tracking heat, signatures redirecting power flows, locking down sections of the base to trap intruders. He moved quickly through the systems, his fingers dancing over keys, his voice calm over comms guiding reinforcements where they were needed. Era heard him through the headset and trusted every word as if it were her own thought. As the sun broke over the horizon, the assassins began to falter, not because they lacked skill, but because they had never expected resistance like this. They had trained to strike fear and silence into their targets, but here they faced people who refused to bow, who fought not for orders, but for each other. Era moved like a storm among them, never pausing, never hesitating, her presence turning the tide of the battle not through numbers, but through will. When the last of the assassins fell, silence returned, not the silence of fear, but the silence of breath, the kind that follows survival. The fighters stood tall around her, some injured, some exhausted, but none broken. Era looked at them not with pride, but with respect, and then she turned her gaze toward the stars, because she knew this was only the beginning. Later that day, as repairs began and the fallen were honored, a signal came through the outer relays, encrypted and old but unmistakable. It was a direct transmission from the Imperial Core, carrying the voice of the king. Era stood alone in the main hall when the message played, her father's face appearing on the screen, his expression unreadable. He did not call her daughter, he did not speak with warmth. He said she was an echo of failure, a crack in his legacy, a flame that needed to be extinguished. He offered her one chance to surrender, return in chains, and be erased quietly, or face the full force of the Empire. Era stood still watching the message finish, then looked out the window where Jake and the others were reinforcing the walls, where people who had once given up now carried hope in their hands. She turned back to the screen and said aloud, not to her father, but to the universe, I am not your broken thing. I am not your shadow. I am the fire you tried to smother. I am the voice you silenced. I am the story you buried. She stepped forward, opened the transmitter, and broadcast her reply through every channel, every relay, every hidden frequency she had access to. Her voice was clear and strong, no longer a whisper in exile, but a roar in defiance. She spoke not just to the king, but to the Empire, to every forgotten soldier, to every silenced voice, to every corner of space where hope had been crushed. She said, you threw me away, you lifted me up, you called me shame, he called me strength, you made a daughter, and he made a legend. The message spread faster than any warship. It lit screens and echoed in bunkers. It reached rebels hiding in ruins and traitors floating between stars. It broke through blockades and sparked in the hearts of people who had once believed they were alone. Era had spoken, and now the galaxy listened. That night she stood on the balcony again, but this time she did not look at the stars with questions, she looked with certainty. Jake came beside her, handed her a mug, and said, so what now? She answered him not with words, but with a small nod, because she knew what came next. Not hiding, not waiting, not surviving. It was time to move forward, to carry the fire to the heart of the Empire itself. Reckoning had begun, and Era would not stop until her fire reached the throne. The days that followed were filled with movement and preparation. The quiet outpost that once stood like a forgotten corner of space now thrived like the heart of a growing force. New faces arrived daily, some young and untested, others worn and scarred by years of battles and betrayals. They brought old weapons, old codes, old memories. But they also brought belief, not in an empire, not in titles, but in Era. They had heard her voice, they had seen her fire. And they had come not to follow a crown, but to walk beside someone who had stood alone and refused to fall. Jake stood by her, sighed through it all, watching the scattered pieces come together like gears forming a machine with purpose. He saw how Era spoke to each newcomer, how she remembered names, how she trained without holding herself above anyone, how she knelt to help. Wounded, how she stood with soldiers during rain and wind and drills that pushed them past breaking. She did not lead like a ruler, she led like someone who had once been broken and now knew how to build others up. The plan was bold and simple at its core. The empire had grown too heavy on its own lies, too sure of its control. The capital system was defended by powerful fleets, but they were spread thin across distant borders and rebellions. The palace station at the heart of the throne world was still strong, but its mind was old, its strategies predictable. Era knew how they thought. She had been trained in those same war rooms. She would not strike from above. She would go straight through the center. Her ships were patched together from stolen frames and abandoned hulls, but they flew with speed and power. Her crew was a mixture of former soldiers, smugglers, miners, engineers, and dreamers. No one wore the same armor, no one walked in perfect lines, but when they moved together, they moved with unity built not from fear, but from fire. As they left the outer systems and headed toward the royal sector, signals of warning began to spread. The Empire knew they were coming. They just did not believe it mattered. The first line of defense met them above the gas moon of Verdun, where Imperial cruisers waited in formation like a steel wall. Era gave no speech. She only looked out the window of the command ship and nodded once. Jake, who sat at the navigation system, adjusted the course and said it was time. They flew straight into the fire, with formations breaking and reforming like waves. The enemy expected hesitation, but Era's forces moved like they had already tasted death and had chosen to live. Louder explosions lit the sky as fighters darted between cruisers and pulse cannons. Drones built by Era danced through enemy shields, opening paths for boarding teams. The rebel ships did not try to destroy everything, they cut through specific targets, guided by Era's knowledge of weak points, old codes, and hidden access routes. By the time the battle ended, 1/3 of the Imperial force had been disabled, not by overwhelming power, but by clever disruption and united will. With little time to rest, they pushed forward before more reinforcements could arrive. The palace station rose before them, a massive ring wrapped around a shining spire floating above the throne world. It was built as a symbol of control, but now it stood like a relic from a forgotten age. Era boarded with a strike team made of those she trusted most. Jake among them, not because he was a soldier, but because he had stood beside her when no one else had. The halls of the station were wide and cold, filled with ancient banners and security. Drones, but Era moved through them with the confidence of someone who had once called these walls home. The resistance they met was fierce but scattered. Many of the guards did not fight to the death. Some even lowered their weapons after seeing Era in the front with her blade in hand and no crown on her head. The stories had reached even here, and not everyone had forgotten who she had been or who she had become. They reached the central chamber after hours of fighting and passage through locked gates. The throne room stood just as she remembered, tall columns, polished floors, and the massive seat carved from black stone at the far end. Her father sat upon it in his royal armor, his face hard, his eyes burning with the weight of a legacy he refused to let go. He did not rise. He did not welcome her. He only asked why she had returned. Era walked forward, not with anger, but with truth. She told him that she had returned not to take his throne, but to end what it stood for. She told him the empire he had built was a machine that devoured its own children. She told him that his strength had been shaped through cruelty, and that his fear of weakness had turned his blood into exile. He listened without expression, then rose from the throne and removed his royal blade, offering one last challenge, not as a king but as a warrior. The battle between them was not long, but every strike held the weight of history. He fought with power, but she fought with purpose. Her movements were not perfect, but they were alive, filled with the energy of one who had rebuilt herself from ashes. When she disarmed him and pressed her blade to his throat, she looked into his eyes and saw not power but emptiness. He told her to finish it, but she lowered her blade and said, "I am not you." She turned away and left him kneeling on the floor. The throne stood behind her, but she did not sit upon it. Instead, she walked to the balcony that overlooked the city and spoke through the loudspeakers in every direction. She told the people they were free to shape something new, something better. She told them the empire was not a crown or a flag, it was people, and people could choose. The soldiers did not resist. The citizens did not protest. The silence that followed was not one of fear, but of breath held before change. In the days that followed, Era refused the title of queen. She helped form a council built from worlds across the galaxy. She returned to the outer systems and rebuilt the outpost as a new center for unity and learning. Jake remained beside her, not in armor, but in his workshop surrounded by machines and peace. Flint stood guard at the gate, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. Children spoke her name not in fear, but in hope. Elders told stories of how the broken daughter had risen not through revenge, but through purpose. Across the stars, people remembered that she had been cast aside, but had refused to be erased. She had been forged not by power, but by choice, by kindness, by struggle, and by fire. Era walked through the dusty yard where it had all begun, her steps steady, her heart quiet. Jake called her name from the tower, asking if she wanted tea. She smiled and nodded and looked at the sky where no throne hung above her, where no crown waited to fall. She was not a ruler, she was not a weapon, she was not forgotten, she was legend now, and her fire would never fade. The end.